and he doesn't get it.
That's his problem.
He doesn't get it.
That's his problem.
Oh, exactly.
There. That works better here.
So can we just move it up just a little?
Oh.
You know what's funny?
If it sits here, then I can move over then. Otherwise, I'm just afraid I'm going to bump it with my
Ah. I'm not worried.
Dropped off my daughter. Who do I see?
You were there?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah?
You take your kids to church? I said, yeah. I was like, oh, it's like a small world. I was like,
There was, when I went down for lunch, there was a bunch of kids walking in the hallway, and I'm like, oh, it must be a pet parade. They're all holding on to teddy bears and. Yeah, we will. I think that's next, isn't it?
All of them. Everything, all 206.
David.
Hello, 206.
David.
200.
When we have that lab, he'll like lay them all out, and we start from the skull and go all the way down.
Okay. Yeah. And then I'll use my power, my mind, and all come together. Some people get freaked out. Most people really
Like Samuel Jackson Towers? See the new ones?
Yeah.
People do all kinds of shit now. Like, you get this big place.
The Force? What kind of movies do you guys watch? Oh! That's funny. Somebody had on their Facebook last night a packet, a random packet, and on the outside it said, I am not your mama. I thought that was funny. And he like played Spider Man this week too. I thought it was it only can do that twice. Like vacuuming type of spider, you know, like we'll push it off.
I love the movies, but
And it's like, and it'll eat them. Yeah. So, you know,
It's really
like,
good.
what kind of game?
I guess you can't, like,
It's like World of Warcraft. I played.
I'm like, you guys, let's find this stuff, you know? It's like,
No, it's pretty much just killed.
yeah, I guess so. Just
Oh, it is great.
that's what I said. You can only look, you know, have that happen twice. He tests twice. So I guess after the second time he dies. I don't know. You have to look it
So then
up.
you might as well just get it.
I didn't play the video game.
I think I'd rather just die on my own than get eaten. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I thought that was kind of funny because I was thinking, well, what the heck? And she just like gets what she wants and gets her dessert after or what?
I mean, like, they really do.
And it was so funny because the songs are progressive talk.
Like,
They'll
it's
bring
very
in a lot of
delightful to
I know. Yeah. But it's so funny because the songs are progressive talk. They talk a lot about the politics and stuff. And I only put that on sometimes like on my way to school so I can kind of know what's going on. You know, when it comes time to having to vote and know who's for what and all that other stuff. Some of the things we want to I don't know. Somebody talks about her website, something like that. I don't know, some of the crap that they talk about is funny. And they'll like bash on the politicians and, oh yeah, I don't really care about the very poor and I don't care about the rich. And it's like, you know, who do you think you're going to get, you know, for votes on that?
Well, for me, it was
For me, that was CGI that doesn't look right.
Oh, they got some.
What color? Or what color?
Probably that's a canon problem.
Oh, it is, and it's nice.
Yeah. Yeah, like,
We can talk about it. If you want to get Star Wars nerdy with me, we can talk about it. Good afternoon, my friends.
I don't know my
Good afternoon, Chuck. Alrighty. So let's finish this week. Alright, okay, so let's talk a little review before we go forward. I'll forget the review. We'll just move forward. I will review in a second after we finish the chapter. Then I'll probably give out the quiz, open the room up for questions, that sort of thing before we start chapter 3, cells and tissues. Okay, so we finished talking about another organic compound which shall remain nameless until we start reviewing later. So let's talk about our last organic compound, or class of organic compound, nucleic acids. Nucleic acids contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. DNA and RNA are the nucleic acids. DNA literally means deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA is ribonucleic acid. DNA, as you know, contains your genes, right? Your genetic blueprint, if you will, for life, right? And RNA is involved in the synthesis of proteins from DNA, because DNA, as I mentioned in lab, basically contains all of the recipes, if you will, all of the proteins that your body makes, that your cells specifically make. Okay, so when we look at nucleic acids, they are composed of nucleotides. So the building blocks of nucleic acids are nucleotides. In the same way that the building blocks of proteins were amino acids, that the building blocks of, say, polysaccharides are monosaccharides. The building blocks of nucleic acids are nucleotides. And this is a nucleotide shown here, and the nucleotide consists of the following components. You have a phosphate group, you have a pentose sugar, meaning you have a 5-carbon, penta meaning 5-carbon sugar. If we're talking about RNA, ribonucleic acid, that sugar is ribose. If we're talking about deoxyribonucleic acid, that sugar is deoxyribose. And then you have a nucleotide base. In the old days, we called them nitrogenous base because they contain a lot of the element nitrogen. Okay? And all three of these components make up a nucleotide. Now, let me go back to just a second. This nucleotide base can be one of 4. It can be adenine,
make up this.
guanine, cytosine, or thymine in DNA. In RNA, uracil replaces thymine. Okay? I'm not going to ask you this, right? I'm not going to ask you about which nucleotide base is in which type of nucleic acid, right? But I just want you to be, for completion, I'm naming them. Okay? And you'll see them many times abbreviated with just the first letter A, G, C, T, or U. And as I said, it's these nucleotides which make up the DNA or RNA molecule. So you know that DNA, we'll start to talk about DNA first. DNA is a double helix, right? If you would, basically it's 2 strands, right, to form a double helix. And you basically think of, say, a ladder, if you will. If you took a ladder, right, and then you twisted the ladder, basically you would have this structure. So that's what we mean by a double helix. Now notice that the backbone of each of these 2 strands, which make up the double helix, are composed of the phosphates and the sugars. The phosphate is shown in purple, the sugar is shown in like a lavender, right? You have alternating lavender and purple color here to represent that the backbone, what would be the sides of the ladder, are alternating phosphates and sugars. And then the rungs, right, of the ladder are the nucleotide bases. In this case, what we're looking at here is this nucleotide. Here you have your phosphate sugar backbone, and then extending out to the middle is the adenine nucleotide. And that adenine nitrogenous base is hydrogen bonded to the complementary nitrogen containing base or nucleotide base on the other side. Again, the backbone is composed of sugar and phosphate, and then extending out to the middle is nitrogen containing base, in this case thymine. They're hydrogen bound to one another. Specific nucleotide bases hydrogen bond with other nucleotide bases. Adenine always binds, hydrogen bonds to thymine And cytosine always hydrogen binds to guanine. Okay? And so what you're looking at all up and down the DNA molecule is a sugar phosphate backbone with the nitrogen-containing bases extending into the center. Okay? All right? And we call these, by the way, complementary bases. Adenine is a complementary base for thymine. Cytosine is a complementary base for guanine. Okay? And this, prior to cell division, this entire DNA molecule replicates itself. And again, yes, ma'am.
Under this, you always get another copy because the A will only go with C and the C will only go with C.
Exactly. Yes, the adenine will only hydrogen bind to C and cytosine to guanine, and so forth and so on. Yep, that's exactly right. Now, this DNA molecule, again, contains the recipe for all the proteins that your body will make. The specific sequence of bases here, they code for specific amino acids. And as you learned on Wednesday, right, the amino acid sequence determines the protein, the specific protein. Okay? So that's how DNA determines who you are, because it determines the protein that your body will make. Right? Proteins that are going into your skin, into your bones, into your teeth, into your hair, etc. Alright, so if hopefully I can pull up this video from YouTube, which is a real quick video, just summarizing what I just described. And I checked it before I came in here. So I checked it on a computer I had. Well, all right. So sorry about that. It works on the computer in the lab, I guess, down in this computer. I do believe this movie is on Blackboard. So if you go into the chemistry folder, right, it'll be there. So I apologize for that. That's what happens when it's cut off. All right. So that was DNA. Let's talk a little bit about ribonucleic acid, RNA. So ribonucleic acid is very much like DNA, except that it's a single strand instead of a complementary strand. And that's because uracil replaces thymine. Right? Uracil doesn't bind or doesn't hydrogen bond with the complementary base. So RNA is a single strand. Also, ribose replaces deoxyribose. RNA, as you will learn in the next chapter, is involved in making protein, right? So DNA is used to make RNA, which is used directly to make protein, right? At least some RNA, messenger RNA. There are three types of RNA. There's messenger, ribosomal, and transfer RNA, all right? At this point, just note that. We'll talk a little later about what the functions are of those different types of RNA. All right, any questions about DNA, RNA, nucleic acids in general? Any at all? Yes, ma'am.
So the DNA is located in the nucleus.
In the nucleus.
Where's the RNA located?
RNA is located in the cytoplasm. Right? It's made from DNA in the nucleus, but then it is transported out to the cytoplasm. Now, I will say, and you don't have to know, there is some DNA in the mitochondria. It's called mitochondrial DNA. Just FYI, I couldn't ask you that. Right? But when I mention it in the next chapter, I don't want you to say, well, wait a minute, you said it's only in the nucleus. Well, that's one exception. Okay, let's talk about ATP, adenosine triphosphate. I know some of you just have been able to wait to talk about ATP since I brought it up. Right? Adenosine triphosphate. This is the energy currency for all the cells in your body. All of the cells in your body require ATP to perform work, to move things, to make things, to break things down. Right? ATP is chemical energy. There are bonds between atoms that when they are broken release energy. And that energy is used by the cell to do some type of work. So here's ATP here, and if you were to take off these two phosphates, what you basically have is adenosine. See, here's a phosphate, here's your pentose sugar, your ribose, right? And then here's your nitrogen, or here's your nitrogen-containing base. All right, so it's basically a nucleotide base with two additional phosphate groups. Now you probably noticed that little squiggly line here, red line here, and here between the first and second phosphate and the second and third phosphate. That is meant to indicate that these are high energy bonds. That is, when they are broken, a lot of energy is released. Energy that can be used by the cell to perform some type of work. Typically, this bond here is broken, and when that bond is broken, a phosphate is released, and what you have left is adenosine diphosphate, or ADP, and that's shown by this equation here. So ATP, the third phosphate is removed, and you get ADP plus inorganic phosphate plus energy that can be used. Some of that energy is lost as heat. Some of that energy can be used by the cell to perform some type of work. This is another figure from your book. So here you have ATP here. The breaking of that bond, by the way, is a hydrolysis reaction because water is involved. Water comes in, breaks that bond, energy is released. What's left is ADP and what's called an inorganic phosphate. Oh, question? So that ATP can be used to do all types of work by the cell. It can be used to transport a substance across the plasma membrane, for example. If it's a muscle cell, it can be used by that muscle cell to contract. It can be used to do chemical work, right? To synthesize something, like to synthesize protein from amino acids, right? Or fat from glycerol and fatty acids, okay? Regardless of what type of work is performed using ATP, heat is always a byproduct of the use of ATP to do some type of work. It's always a byproduct. And of course, ADP, inorganic phosphate, remain after ATP is hydrolyzed.
Always a byproduct of what?
And how do we regenerate ATP after we use it?
Always a byproduct of what?
Right? Your muscle uses ATP to contract, right? How do we regenerate more ATP? Right? I think I heard several answers that are really correct, right? You know, that food that you eat, right? The energy that you consume, right? That's used. Your body burns principally sugar, glucose, right? To provide the energy to add that phosphate back and regenerate ATP. Okay? The body uses ATP to do some type of work. You consume more food to use the energy in that food to regenerate and make more ATP. Right?
So I got a stupid question. Where does the phosphate come from? I mean, from the food, but where?
Oh, it's swimming. It's there. Yeah, it's
okay.
There in the cytoplasm.
Okay.
Right. Well, I should say in the mitochondrion specifically.
Okay.
Right. Because that's where most ATP is.
Produce.
No, but most. Yes, ma'am.
How does it get into the mitochondria?
It's transported.
So somehow, somewhere, it goes through the cell wall, cell membrane, into the cytoplasm, into the mitochondria, and then it hangs out there until it can be.
Now, I do not recall, I don't even know if I ever knew where the phosphate is actually formed. It could be formed by the cell in the cytoplasm. I honestly do not recall if it's. My guess is it's not. You don't get the phosphate directly from your food, like it's absorbed into the blood and then transported to. My guess is it's actually made intracellularly.
Okay.
Right, and then it is attached to the ATP, to the ADP to make ATP. Yes, ma'am.
Do kids make more anything? Why do you put so much energy?
Because they have no responsibilities.
That's a whole different class.
They have more ATP.
Well, I cannot answer that definitively, meaning I have no, I can't, there's no scientific journal I've read or anything I've read in a book.
How about this? They have less cells using energy.
That will necessarily tell you that. But I will say this: they do. Kids are producing red blood cells at a faster pace than we are. Most of us in here, well, all of us in here, for the most part, we're only making red blood cells in our flat bones, which you'll learn about next week, and certain parts of our long bones in our legs. Whereas kids, particularly infants, toddlers, just about every bone in their body is churning out red blood cells. Right. Now, I am sure that is not the only reason. That may be a reason, right? But I cannot answer that to be truthful. They also tend to be lighter, right? They tend to have a better body mass index, right? Right. I know. Now, believe it or not, I've heard many people, including my wife, talk about how sugar makes kids spaz out. There's no scientific evidence that is the case. There's no scientific evidence to support that. That doesn't mean that that's not true, but it means that has not been proven as of yet. I think we're okay. Yeah, that was pretty much the end. So
we're gonna have another quiz. Another quiz opens up.
All right. Questions about anything having to do with chemistry. All right. Any questions at all? Okay. Grant.
I was wondering if you could explain that chemical, the transport of mechanical work with ATP work. I mean, is it one? Does chemical work for all both transport and mechanical, or is it just ATP working for all three of those?
Okay. Okay. Now remember what work is. Work is just moving something. Right? ATP contains the energy is needed to perform work. And the cell does all kinds of work. If it's a muscle cell, right, like a cell in your biceps brachii, where it's going to physically pull on your bones, right? That's mechanical work. Well, in order for your skeletal muscle cells to contract, ATP has to be broken down to ADP in order to provide the energy so that the muscle can contract. And later on in the semester, we'll talk about this specifically, how that happens. Right? You remember how it binds the actin? Binds the actin, and then the actin binds with the myosin. Excuse me. It binds the myosin head. The myosin head interacts with the actin filament, pulls on it, and all that stuff. Right? So that's more specific than you need to know at this point.
Sure.
But muscles can only contract if ATP is present, because that's its energy source.
Right, converts to ADP first.
Well, it converts to ADP as the bond is broken, the energy is released, which causes something to move. Right? Here, ATP causes a change in the shape of this protein, allowing it to transport a molecule across the membrane. But without the presence of ATP, right, no transport work is being done. Here, in order to form a bond, energy is needed to form a bond. So in order for a bond to form between these two molecules, ATP has to lose its phosphate. You notice here that phosphate is temporarily added to one molecule. Here again, phosphate is temporarily added to that molecule. that phosphate came from the ATP. Right? Again, beyond what you need to know right now. Right now, you just conceptually you need to understand that ATP is used by the cell to do work. So whenever a cell is moving, or something inside of the cell is moving, right? ATP is involved. Okay, no questions? Well, I have some questions. Okay, so before we move on, we'll review biochemistry just a little bit, right? Okay, so for each organic compound that we talked about, right? You need to know for each organic compound. You need to be able to recognize its structure. Right? And by that I mean, if I put like a little silhouette of it, right, you should be able to ID it. If I put up a little silhouette of a triglyceride, you should be able to recognize that as a triglyceride. If I did a silhouette of a DNA molecule, right, if I did something, if I put this on something like that, on an exam, you should be able to recognize that. It'd be a little better than that, but, right, you recognize that if I said, is that a carbohydrate, or is that a nucleic acid, or is that a lipid? You should be able to be able to tell, no, it's not a lipid, no, it's not a carbohydrate, that's a nucleic acid. Yes, sir.
Just turn the lights on up there.
Oh, to see the board, he wants the light on.
I'm sorry. Right? I thought I was the only one in the room. Okay, so be able to recognize the structure. Okay, be able to know. Also know for those that we talked about, right? We didn't talk about this for everything. But know source, right? Know function. Okay, let's go through them real quick. All right, what's the first organic compound we talked about? Carbohydrate. Cool. Carbohydrate. And give me some examples of carbohydrates. Well, first of all, we say carbohydrates are classified by what? Size. Right? All right. What are the three we talked about? Monosaccharides, di, and polysaccharides. Okay? Where do we get them? And I know in our food, but okay, there's sugars and starches, and where do we get sugars and starches? Plants. Right? For the most part. A little bit in the skeletal muscles that you consume. Right? But mainly from plants. Right? And for the most part, what does everybody do with them? Use it for energy, almost exclusively for energy. Very, very little carbohydrate is actually incorporated into your tissues. Most of it is used for energy, right? Exclusively for energy, right? Just so you know, with 4 kilocalories per gram, right, carbohydrates. That's just FYI, not so bad. All right, what's the next one we talked about?
So as far as the structure of that,
Hold on, we got a question. Go ahead.
For the structure of a carbohydrate, are you gonna show us a picture of a disaccharide and we'll have to identify it?
That'd be a mono. No, I'd want you to be able to identify it as carbohydrate. Right, not as a mono. Alright, if I showed you that, you should be able to know that's carbohydrate. If I had 1, or be a mono. If I had 2, it'd be disaccharide. Long,
Based on
right. It's basic silhouette, right? Basic silhouette, right? If you go back and you look at the four types of organic compounds, and even within them, they look completely different. There's no way, if you have any idea what they look like, that you can mix them up. Right? Just like DNA doesn't look like anything else. It doesn't look anywhere like it. Right? Okay. Next one. Lipids.
So carbohydrate is a type of
Carbohydrate, you said basic
compound, right?
structure, C. What? Right, just so you get the idea, it's got carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, right? It's got twice as much as hydrogen, as carbon, oxygen. Okay, lipids, tell me about lipids. Recognize structure. Well, what types do we have? Triglyceride. Give me some examples of triglyceride. What? Butter. And parquet too. Margarine, lard, canola oil. All the fats and oils that you're familiar with, right? All of them are triglycerides, right? What other kind of lipids? What are they? Phospholipids. Okay, what else? Steroids. All right. What do we get off this stuff, by the way? Animals, plants, both. Animals, plants, both, right? Vegetable oil. Well, you should know. I mean, you should have. It's sort of intuitive, if you know what lipids are, you should sort of know. Right? If you know vegetable oil is a lipid, right? That butter is a lipid, then you sort of know, well, we take a step back and think, you can look both. Right? Okay, triglycerides. You talked about that. Phospholipids, where are they found in the body? Where is your body, what are they used for? Plasma membrane, right? They make up plasma membrane. All right, what about steroids? All steroids come from what? Well, what's the parent compound of steroids? All steroids come from cholesterol, right? Cholesterol is used to make steroids, right? Functions of steroids include what? Or examples of steroids? Vitamin D. Okay, well, vitamin D. What? Insulin? Insulin, well, okay, I know what you're thinking. Hormones. Okay, hormones. All right, insulin happens to be a protein hormone, but there are all the steroid hormones. Okay, so steroid hormones, right, and cholesterol is there. Bile salts. Oh, yes, very good. I forgot that. Right, bile salts. Okay, no, we didn't talk about the function of triglycerides in the body. So let me ask you, what's the function of triglycerides in the body? All right, fat. Fat, basically, what you know is animal. That fat in our body, by the way, is animal fat. We are animals.
So it protects.
So we got subcutaneous fat that helps insulation, right? And you also have visceral fat and inflammation. You have visceral fat, which helps protect your organ. Right? And of course, energy. Your body stores fat as energy. Right? Energy storage. In fact, fat is the most, has between carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, fat is the most calorically dense, right? It's 4 kilocalories in a gram of carbohydrates. Guess how much in a gram of lipids? 9, that's right. 9 kilocalories per gram. Right? That is why typically if you're going on a diet where you're trying to lose weight, what do you cut out or reduce? You reduce the fat because an equal amount of fat has twice as much energy as an equal amount of carbohydrate or protein. Okay? All right.
How does that thing work, though?
You deprive the body of carbohydrates and you force it to consume fat. Because your body, for the most part, consumes carbohydrate first, lipids second, and protein last. Why would the body consume protein last? It's what your body's made of, right? Right? All right. So you're at home. It's Wisconsin. It's January. What are you going to use first for heat? Right? MG&E. MG&E gets cut off. Right? Then you may start cutting up the couch and throwing it in the fireplace. Right? Okay. Protein, right? Yeah. Right. Protein. Building blocks of proteins are what? Amino acids. All right. What do we got on amino acids?
You're gonna write that down, huh?
Plants, probably more animals than
He says when you do that, it's forced to burn the fats.
Alright, and I told you there were two
They're
basic
depriving it
categories
of the carbs.
of protein. It's your body makes. Right, fibers and vitamins. What's the difference?
Fibers are structural and
What's the
others are functional.
Fibers are structural properties like collagen, keratin, in your skin, in your teeth, in your nails, and your bones, right? And globular, they have functions other than structure, right? So here's some examples of globular proteins. Enzymes, cool. Enzymes, hormones, antibodies, hemoglobin, right? Just do things that have functions in the body other than structure. Right? What happens is your body, you consume a protein, right? Like you say, you have a quarter pound of cheese, right? Protein in that. Your body digests the protein down to amino acids, you absorb the amino acids into your bloodstream, right? And then your cells take up the amino acids and then start.
What does the double A stand for again?
Amino acids.
Amino acids. Thanks.
Cool. Right? Well, we just talked about nucleic acids. Rehash that. Okay, cool. Alrighty. I wanted to do that because students tend to have a lot of trouble with the biochemistry part of chemistry because it's new. Right? Okay? You just go back, look at my study guide where I list what you need to know for each of the different organic compounds. Right? It's basically this. Okay? All right. Oh, question? Go ahead, question. Yes, question. No. Structure. Ooh, good question. Well, steroids, of course, have that. I'm not going to draw it. I'm just going to show you. Okay. Proteins. That'd be. If I were to show you a protein, I would expect you to be able to identify, something like that. Recognize that as a protein. Or that as a protein. Right? Yeah. Again, I'm looking at silhouettes. I'm not looking at deep, formulas with carbons and hydrogens.
That's what I gotta remember.
Right. There's a steroid. Right. They have that 4-ring structure. Okay. Right. Here's a triglyceride here. There's a phospholipid here. Right. Again, a silhouette. I'm not going to show you all the carbons and all that stuff. That's way beyond what you do. Okay. You'll find that for the most part, what we cover in class, what I have on the information I have on my slides is I make the review sheets out directly from the I make the review sheet out from the slides, and I make the exam directly from the review sheet. What? Well, the book gives you, the book sort of gives you a nice story and everything, and I sort of bottom line it.
Yes, we just finished chapter 2, so now there'll be a chapter 2 quiz. He hasn't chapter 1 open until yet, because he wanted to go over all that stuff on the chalkboard.
Okay. Alrighty, so lastly, before we leave chemistry, I need to make sure that you have a firm grasp of it.
So now chapter 2 is on Blackboard?
It is.
Closes Monday.
Now, right? Quiz for chapter 2. It opens now. Well, at least it will in 24 minutes, 2:30. And it will be open until Monday at midnight. This time I have made sure that you have 10 minutes. What I did not realize is it defaults to an hour at 0 minutes. And so I just went and clicked 10 minutes. I didn't realize I already had an hour sitting there. So last time you had an hour and 10 minutes. I did not realize that. Right? You did not need an hour and 10 minutes for 12 questions. Right? That were taken from a pool of questions that was on the internet. Right? Okay, so this time you have 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, it will go, get out. Right? And what you have is what you have. Right? So that should not be a problem. Okay? There is, again, an alternate quiz. So if something screws up on that first quiz, right? Computer locks up, you lose connectivity, heat goes up, electricity goes out, whatever. Take the alternative.
On a different computer.
On a different computer. Well, if the electricity goes out, you need to go to a different house. All right, it's in the assignments tab in Blackboard. All right? Cool? Okay. I need you to do something for me in preparation for... All right, class, come back to me. Come back to me. Come back to me. This is very important. All right? Listen to me now. Believe me later. Think about what I've said next week. Okay? Next week's lab is probably one of your hardest labs in terms of sheer quantity of material that you have to learn. We will be starting the skeletal system. Okay? And specifically, you're going to learn the bones and the bone features of the appendicular skeleton. Those are the bones of your appendages, your limbs, and the girdles that attach those limbs to your torso. They're called girdles. In preparation for lab next week, what I will need you to do, in addition to looking at the streaming videos, right, doing your typical pre-lab prep, bringing off the study guides, sort of reading over what we're going to cover in lab, I also need you to do the following. I need you to memorize, or let's say learn. That sounds better. You're not supposed to have you memorize. Learn the bones of the appendicular skeleton, right? The bones of the appendicular skeleton are basically everything shown here that's not in green. Right? I need you to learn those bones before for next week's lab. No, you just need to know this as a whole. The study guide will tell you. Right? Okay? Now, this is how I suggest you go about learning them. All right? So, your upper limbs are attached to your torso by the pectoral girdle. That's basically your collarbone or clavicle and your scapular or shoulder blade. Okay? So the logical way to study and learn these bones is to start at the girdles and learn them all the way down to the tips of your fingers. Right? So you'll learn clavicle and scapula, then humerus, then your bones of your forearm, which are your radius and your ulna, then the bones of the wrist, the carpal area are called the carpals. You don't have to know the individual carpal bones. Right? Then the bones of the palm are the metacarpals, and then the phalanges, which are the bones of the finger. Again, you don't have to know the individual bones. Okay?
So you gotta know like the processes and stuff too, right?
No.
That's later.
We're gonna get to those details in lab. That's why I want you to. All right, you're gonna learn the different bone features, the different bumps and grooves and holes and stuff in your bone when we get to lab. That's why it's important that you at least just know the names of the bones before you come there. Okay, and then do the same thing with the limbs, with the lower limbs. Right, this is the pelvic girdle. Right, you've got your what's called hip bones here. Start here, learn those bones all the way down, starting here and learning them all the way down to your toes.
Same thing with foot and ankle. We don't need to know.
Right. You have carpal bones in the wrist. You have tarsal bones in the wrist. There are a couple there you have to know: the calcaneus, the tarsus. Right. Okay. Right, and if you start here and go to the end, you'll begin to build a mental picture. right? Yes, ma'am.
So when we learn the bone, so you want us to learn it as the real name, not the hip bone. And
Correct. Yeah,
right.
no, not the hip bone.
And
Right.
you know,
This is
like
actually three.
pelvis
This is
and
the coccyx bone. Right, or oscoxide or nominate. It's actually 3 bones in one, but I don't want to go there with you, okay? If you can do that, you will really have a good leg up for next week's class.
a good leg up.
Alright. Okay? Alright, so that's my suggestion.
Because, you know, your leg.
Okay,
What part
so.
of the leg? The humerus? The tibia? The tibia?
Okay, so now we're going to start our discussion on cells and tissue. All right, so we've covered the basic, the most, the lowest level of structural organization of the body, which is the chemical level. Now we're going to move up to cells and then up to tissues before we start our first organ system, which will be the skeletal system. All right? So first we're going to talk a little bit about, or remind you, I should say, review the primary elements which make up the body. And we'll discuss a few trace elements as well. And then we'll start looking at the anatomy of the generalized cell. Now this will be some review or overlap from lab. All right, the cell lab we had last week. Right? But students don't typically mind a little overlap. Right? You need a good reinforcement material.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And then we'll probably be out of time. So that's probably about as far as we'll get for today. Okay? So does anyone ever think about, well, where did the term cell come from? Well, it was actually given by a man by the name of Robert Hooke back in the 1600s. He was looking under the microscope, a crude microscope by our standards, at some cork. And when he did, he saw something that looked like this. This is basically dead cork cells. All we have remaining really are the cell walls, right, of the cork. And when he looked at them, these cells, these structures that he saw, reminded him of the living quarters of monks, which were called cellulae at the time. All right, and that is where the cell got its name.
Did I know that?
The cell is 60% water. Remember, I have told you over and over again that you are the most abundant substance in your body is water. Right? The cell itself is about 60% water. Its structural components are mainly protein, right? Particularly by weight. It's overwhelmingly protein. And the most abundant elements that make up a cell are, of course, the elements which make up protein: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. Right? And then you have lesser amounts of these other elements: calcium, sodium, potassium, chloride, iron, etc. Remember, C. Hopkins Cafe, mighty good and naturally clean, if you want to remember the list of those elements which make up about 99% of the body. Okay? Now, I want you to also keep in mind that a cell, a given cell, only interacts with the environment around it. Right? So it's highly dependent on the extracellular fluid outside of itself. Right? It gets its nutrients directly from the interstitial fluid right outside its plasma membrane. It also deposits its secretions and waste products into that interstitial fluid. Right? And also note that this interstitial fluid is derived from the blood. Right? Everything that's here comes either from the blood or from the cell. The cell deposits waste products. The blood brings in nutrients, oxygen, things of that nature. A cell carries out all of the life-sustaining processes required to keep you alive. Right? So you're only alive because of the cells in your body carrying out activities necessary to keep you alive. Also, every component in every part of your body is either part of a cell or was produced by a cell. Right? There's nothing that is of your body that wasn't either synthesized by a cell or is part of the cell itself. Okay? So in that way, cells are the building blocks of all living things. Okay? Everything that lives is composed of cells and cell products. Okay? A large function of what a cell does is make specific proteins, right, associated with its life-sustaining activities. Okay? And as we discussed this week, cells, similar in structure and therefore function, work collectively to carry out a specific function as a tissue. And tissues make up organs. Okay? I know when you're sick, you don't think much about, what's happening at the cellular level. But let me remind you that we live and we die at the cellular level. Right? When you are sick, it's because your cells are being negatively impacted by a bug of some sort, a bacterium, a virus, or what have you. When an organ fails, right, it fails because its cells literally are dying. Okay? We don't think of it that way because we think, at the organ layer, we think of what we can see, right? You think a person dies, a person's sick, or an organ is sick, or an organ fails, right? But really what's happening is, we live and we die at the cellular level. Right? Cells die, tissues die, causing organs to die, and then the person dies. Okay? So just keep that in mind. Now, as I mentioned in lab, not all cells are the same. We have a great diversity of cells in our bodies. So when we talk about the anatomy of the cell, understand that we're talking about the generalized cell. We're talking about the basic properties that all cells have. Understanding that cells do differ quite significantly from one to the next. But all of them have three regions. They have a nucleus, they have a plasma membrane, they have a cytoplasm, right? And most of the organelles that we're going to talk about, all cells have, right, in one form or another. Okay? So you can divide any cell into three regions: the nucleus, the plasma membrane, and the cytoplasm, which lies between the nucleus and the plasma membrane. Let's look first at the nucleus. That's probably about as far as we're going to get. All right? So this is an isolated nucleus along with some rough endoplasmic reticulum, which typically lies right outside the nucleus, right? You recall that the nucleus contains the DNA, right? The genetic material. It is the genetic material that's responsible for the recipe of all the proteins that cell is going to make. We can subdivide the nucleus into three regions as well, right? You have the nuclear envelope, you have the nucleolus, and then you have the nucleoplasm, like the cytoplasm. You have a nucleoplasm. All right, that's where the chromatin, which contains the DNA, is located. Okay? Let's talk a little bit about the nuclear envelope. So the nuclear envelope consists of two membranes, and each membrane is composed of a phospholipid bilayer. Okay? Notice that there are numerous pores in the nuclear membrane, and those pores allow substances to move into the nucleus and out of the nucleus. In fact, if you were to magnify one of those pores, you'd see that those pores are formed from the merging of the two plasma membranes. And again, the function of those nuclear pores is to allow substances to move into and out of the nucleus. Okay? Alrighty, it is 2:20. It is Friday. I am not going to hold you over. Thank you so much. Have a great day, a great weekend. And don't forget to learn those dry bones.
In the middle of the slide, they show